Welcome to the Ideas Hour with your hosts David Cameron and Suzanne Zeedyk, exploring big ideas that matter. This series was originally broadcast on Teacher Hug Radio in 2021 and 2022. It is still available in their archive as well as in this format.
We've something really unusual for you today in the Ideas Hour. We're going to explore a campaign that's grown up over the past year called the Witches of Scotland campaign. And what it does is it seeks to right what its leaders see as a total miscarriage of justice. Stronger words have been used to describe the period in Scottish history, and a lot of press coverage covering the campaign talks about persecutions. The campaigners aim to help others see how conviction for witchcraft, which we might see as rather ancient history, is still relevant today. This is a really big idea because it intersects with so many other current campaigns around restorative justice, around how we make recompense and resolution with the past. And it also ties into lots of the current debates about history and how we mark it and so much more. So today's discussion is not just big ideas, it's big questions. Should we rewrite history? And if so, who decides? Is changing the stories we tell ourselves about our history the same as rewriting it? How do we acknowledge persecution, brutalization, or exploitation that people in the past may have suffered? Does restorative justice matter? And if so, why? And why does it work? And what is it about acknowledgement and apologies that help to heal past hurt?
Our guests today are Claire Mitchell and Zoe Venditozzi, the two women leading the Witches of Scotland campaign. Claire is a lawyer who specializes in miscarriages of justice, and her voice carries weight, for she's a QC, which for our many listeners who are unfamiliar with Scottish legal jargon is the abbreviation for the high-level advocate known as Queen's Counsel. And Zoe is an author who has always had an interest in Scotland's witches, which you describe, Zoe, as a dark mark against Scotland, and which you believe needs a reckoning. I cannot wait to welcome both of you and to talk about your campaign, the Witches of Scotland. A very big welcome to the Ideas Hour. It's great to have you both here. Can we start by asking why you so eagerly and charmingly accepted our invitation? Why did you want to come today?
Well, Suzanne, I'm familiar with your work because as well as being an author and a campaigner, I'm a teacher. And I'm really interested in trauma-informed practice. And so I've followed what you've done for a number of years. So I was really keen to come on and chat to you. But I think also, you know, we talked previously about the fact that the campaign has got modern relevance, and sometimes people struggle to understand what that modern relevance is. So I think that there's very contemporary themes that we can discuss with you today.
Fantastic. Claire?
Yeah, similarly, Suzanne, you and I have worked together on at least one case that I'll not obviously discuss just now, but and I think that the work that you do is very, very interesting. I also think that when we talk about what we're sorry for and how we move forward from bad things that have happened, the way in which we reflect on them is important, and the way in which history is recorded is important. And I think it's just a great opportunity to speak to more people looking at our history through a different lens. I sort of look at the history of women in Scotland through the lens of a miscarriage of justice. You look at it through trauma, and it's interesting to meet other people with different views to see how they view the world then and how it fits into their worldview now.
It's a delight to have you here.
I just absolutely love this. So we've now got a program where everybody wants to be on with my co-presenter, Suzanne. And I just need to apologise for gate crashing this whole thing here.
Dave, I'm also familiar with your work within education, and I'm of course a huge fan. I should mention at that point.
Well, thank you very much. And I have to say, along with re-evaluating the history of witches in Scotland, better late than never. So that's good to know. For everyone, including me, please just kind of set out the central theses of your campaign, and maybe just say, Claire, what's the key thing that you would want our listeners to know about it?
Really what we're trying to do is get people to engage in the history of Scotland, in particular, the history mostly of women in Scotland in early modern history. I think you referred to the fact that it was a very long time ago, and in fact, in terms of history, it's a very short time ago. We are talking about the early modern Scotland that this happened in, but 400, 500 years ago, there was, over a period of 200 years, what has been described as a satanic panic, but basically 4 or 5 periods during that time where a vast number of people in Scotland were accused of witchcraft. At that time, there were approximately 1 million people in Scotland, and of those 1 million people, at a very rough estimate and a very modest estimate, 4,000 people were accused of witchcraft, and 2,500 of those were executed for witchcraft. And again, that's a modest approximation. Of those people, 85% were women, so it was a gendered issue. And what other countries have done is that they have gone back through their history, they've recognised what has happened, and they have apologised and memorialised what has happened. So they've shed light on the subject, they've addressed it, they've come to terms with it, and they've moved forward. In Scotland, that hasn't happened at all. There are a number of groups, small groups around Scotland, which do work trying to raise awareness of local people that have died. There are various small memorials, but what there isn't, and what the Witches of Scotland campaign wants, is 3 things. It wants a pardon, a legal pardon for those that were convicted. Many were accused but never convicted. For example, they died while they were waiting for trial or in torture, or they were acquitted but their lives were forever ruined. They were excommunicated from their family, they were banished. So what we want is not only a pardon for those that were convicted, but we want apologies for all those that were accused. And the third thing is that we want some kind of national memorial, a state memorial, which identifies the wrong done to these people and makes it clear that the acknowledgement that this was a terrible wrong done, so that we can reflect upon that and hopefully find ourselves never in that situation again.
So much in that, Claire, that touches on questions that are going to come up later in the interview. And you've done such a good job, I think, in scene setting. But Zoe, maybe just to give you the opportunity to come in and say why you think this idea matters so much right now.
Well, for me personally, I think it's really important for 2 things on top of what Claire said. The first thing is that as an educator, I'm really keen for people to get educated. And I think it's something that we don't really know about in Scotland. We don't really know an awful lot about it beyond the stereotypes of the witch and the pointy hat and the cat and so on. And it's something that we really need to know about because it's such a big thing that happened in our past. And the second reason is, I think probably, again, stems from the job that I do, which is that I think if we don't sort out things that went wrong in the past and we don't take responsibility, even if we, this generation or, contemporary alive people now, weren't directly responsible for it, it is something in our past that shaped our nation in some ways. So I think if we don't right those wrongs, then we're doomed to possibly do similar things again, or just to lack the full understanding and the empathy that we can develop as humans. So I think that's really important because I think that can then sort of cascade into other areas of Scottish life. So for example, about facing up to the past of slavery in Scotland and how Scotland benefited from it in a national way, but also down to a personal way, about thinking about people personally, things that they've done that they might want to restore what happened and then move forward, lighter as a result of it. So they're the reasons that I'm particularly interested.
Oh, and can I ask both of you, given that so many of our listeners are teachers or members of school communities in the education sector, Could I ask why you think this might have particular relevance for that community? What would you say to that?
I think I genuinely feel that restorative practice is so important. And I think that it's more important each day that passes. So I think that anything where you can model to communities, whether it's an education community within a school or if it's a broader community, like say actually nationally across Scotland, this is the way that we deal with things in an adult and thoughtful and compassionate way. This is how we become better people, I think has got to be for the good.
Claire?
Well, I would hope they're particularly relevant because they are the history of Scotland. We've spoken, Zoe and I, about our history being taught to us in schools and how that lacked a particular relevance for us. Certainly, I was taught about the Highland clearances, but the information wasn't about the people that were removed from their homes. It was about the introduction of Cheviot sheep and how they took to the land and how you left a field fallow and things like that. And the actual stories of individual people were lost to us. So on an educational basis, I think it would be great or really important if people engaged with this part of history, which is not well known in Scotland. A lot of people know that there were witch trials, but they don't know the full scale of it. So I think just first of all, from a general educational viewpoint, that is interesting. Secondly, as Zoe has said, I think it is interesting that we investigate why it's important to say sorry for things, why it's important to acknowledge what went wrong and to try and understand what went wrong. And if we can do that on a grand scale as a country, we can also scale that down and do it as an individual scale with ourselves and with other people. So I think it's a good template to see whether or not a country is big enough to say sorry for its past. Then individuals can come to terms with their own past and move on from that as well.
And so important because so many schools will use Arthur Miller's The Crucible as a text. It's been done as a play, it's been done as a ballet recently. Scottish Ballet did it without any reference at all to how it sits within our own history. And I think there's something really fascinating around that whole idea of what we choose to remember. And I love what you're saying about the idea of how all of that plays into our sense of who we are. And your idea of trying to individualize the lessons of history for the way that we think about ourselves and the way we think about how we live our lives. But maybe it would be interesting for everyone, including me again, to know how you get into this. Claire, you're a QC, as Suzanne announced. Zoe, you're a teacher, writer. You've got all of that. And you're leading in this campaign, which looks like it's focused somehow or other in the past. So it'd be really, I think, intriguing for people to come back into the discussion and hear more about what motivated you personally to get into this campaign.
The reason I became interested in the story of the women as witches was, in fact, Longbourn. I have always been interested in history. I've always been interested in the sort of Gothic as well. But I didn't really know very much about the number of women killed as witches, but I knew that there were witchcraft trials. The type of law that I do now mostly is I deal with miscarriage of justice cases. So I'm an appellate lawyer. So I look at cases involving miscarriages of justice. And put very shortly, I was doing some research on a previous Lord Advocate called the Bloody Mackenzie. And I was in the library reading a book about him. And he was not a great fan of the witch trials. I don't think his heart was in it really. And he was watching a woman who was being tortured by, I think it was lack of sleep. I don't know if it said, it wasn't a physical torture in the sense of thumbnails or anything, but she may have been tortured through lack of sleep. And they were asking her about being a witch, and she said, "Can you be a witch and not know it?" And I felt so affected by hearing that phrase, that this poor bewildered woman who was surrounded by all these people saying she was a witch was so befuddled that she was asking her accusers, "Is it possible that I'm a witch and I might not know it?" And I felt so sad. hearing that, it really had quite an effect on me. And so I then started a bit more and learnt a bit more about witch trials, found out more about their numbers, but I hadn't really any idea that I would ever take that anywhere. That was just for personal interest. And I also read a book by a wonderful woman called Sarah Sheridan, who has written a book called Where Are the Women? And she reimagines Scotland as a place where everything is named after women, all the statues are of women, and it's just a great reimagining book of women's stories. And one day I was walking my dogs in Princess Street Gardens, having a break from the work that I do, and I'm steeped in history. When I work, I'm in a court that's centuries old. I'm wearing 18th century men's clothes, wig and gown on my head. You know, I live in the old town. It's that sort of world of history that I'm in. But I was walking my dogs in Princess Street Gardens when I was looking around and reflecting on Sarah's book, thinking there are no statues of women here. If you beam down here from a foreign planet, you wouldn't even know women existed. And I got to the top of Princess Street Gardens and saw the statue to Wojciech the bear, the full-sized bear, who was a really, really great bear in the war. And I thought, there's an actual statue of a bear here, and who did something really great, and no statues of women. And not only are we not properly recording the fantastic things that women have done, and we're not properly recording the history of those women, but we're also not recording when things have gone terribly wrong. And I looked over to the Castle Esplanade and I thought, I know hundreds of women were killed there in a terrible miscarriage of justice, and we have nothing to reflect that. We have what's called the Witches' Well, which said 300 witches were killed here. Some used their powers for good, some for evil. It's not commemorative, it's not restorative. That's the only thing that is there. And all of a sudden, all these things came together at the one time. And I thought, do you know what? What these people need is they need to be properly remembered as people, just folk, not as witches. History should record that. Their names should be cleared. And by the time I'd walked home, I just sat down and sort of wrote the manifesto. I want a pardon, I want an apology, and I want a national memorial. And shortly after, I met Zoe Venditozzi at a mutual friend's wedding. I had not met Zoe before, and I'll let Zoe take over.
Well, basically, we got talking about, you know, when you first meet somebody, trying to find things that you're going to bond over, and we bonded a bit over both of our love for true crime podcasts and podcasts more sort of generally. And I said to Claire that I really wanted to do my own podcast, and she said, "Well, funny you should mention that. I've got this idea. Do you want to get involved in it?" And then some time passed, and Claire got in touch and said, "Remember that conversation we had? I've started work on it, so would you like to get involved now?" And that's really where we came from there. And then we launched on International Women's Day, because we do feel that it is a very strong feminist issue, and we're both lifelong feminists, I'm happy to say. And we launched it then, not realizing, of course, this proves that we ourselves are not witches and are not gifted any sort of second sight. We then pretty much immediately went into a lockdown, which stopped play. But actually, it's been a really brilliant thing, because it means that everybody's gotten used to Zoom formats. It means that we can speak to guests literally all over the world that we would not have been able to speak to otherwise, because I don't think we would have had this communication language that we've got, where I could get in touch, or Claire could get in touch with, say, a historian in Denmark and say, "Listen, we're doing a podcast, do you want to appear on it?" And then we would just set it up really quite easily. I don't think we would have done that pre-pandemic. So it's been brilliant. And we started off with Claire had a plan for doing 6 episodes. We recorded the first one in my basement with a phone propped up against the washing machine. Claire's brother, who's a sound engineer, heard it and said, "Oh dear God, I'm not having my family name attached to this. I will sound engineer your podcast from now on." So we started off, and we're now, I think we've just maybe recorded the 39th, maybe something like that. So we've recorded absolutely tons, and it's kept us going through the pandemic, which has been quite nice actually, to have that routine on top of everything else. So that's basically where it came from. And we've gotten to know each other really nicely actually through the podcast, because we really didn't know each other before we started recording. So it's been interesting.
We should say, though, it's not simply Zoe and I talking. We're always talking to actual experts.
Oh yeah,
about
I mean, we don't even have 2 podcast amount of material. It's a different expert every single episode. We speak to somebody who knows what they're talking about, and we learn as we're going because we didn't know really anything, it turns out.
So two massive thank yous. Thank you, first of all, for redefining the whole concept of wedding small talk. You know, none of that, you bride or groom. It's like, I'm thinking about doing a podcast. Are you in? Great introduction, brilliant. The other thank you, though, is you've touched on this whole issue of violence against women, and you've talked about looking at the issue of Witches of Scotland through a feminist lens. Suzanne and I have also done a really interesting interview with Joan Smith, who explores the whole idea of violence within families, and particularly violence against women, as a lead-in, if you like, to activities associated with terrorism. And there's a huge issue, I think, around violence against women. And I just wondered if you wanted to maybe pick up a bit more on that whole idea of the gendered nature of the persecution of witches.
Well, I mean, certainly in Scotland, we had a slightly higher amount of women that were accused than in other countries. So I think, Claire, correct me if I'm wrong with this one, because stats are not my strong point. It's round about 80% on average, I think, across Europe were women. In Scotland, we excelled in accusing women of witchcraft because we were 85% or so. Now, that's not to say that obviously 15% of those accused were men. So this isn't an issue that's exclusively about women, but it is an issue where it mostly affected women. And quite often, well, it was other women that would accuse women of it as well, which I think is an interesting dynamic that we've not spoken about too much before. But of course, it was men that ran the courts, it was men that ran the churches, you know, so it was very gendered. And that, you know, we've talked recently, Claire and I, with an expert about the issue of warlocks and why that was okay, and it was men. And also about, there's a sort of a class issue too, that if you had money, you were more likely to kind of get off with the charges. And if you were a man and you were accused, the very first point was that if you were what was known as a quarrelsome dame, which Claire and I both really love that title. But if you were seen as a quarrelsome dame, i.e. you'd fall out with people, you'd stand up for yourself, you might haggle a bit in the marketplace, you might be difficult in some way, a bit mouthy in some way, that was the first proof that you were in fact a witch. So if somebody went to a man and said, oh, you're quarrelsome and you've got too much to say, the man would be able to say, how dare you? I'm a man. How can I be like that? Whereas women really wouldn't have any real method of defense for that one. So that's something that the two of us have been talking about recently that's quite interesting. I mean, interesting is the wrong word. It's appalling, but it's still relevant now, unfortunately.
Yeah, the point of people being accused of witchcraft, the reason why it was mostly women, the theology behind it was that women were the weaker sex, both intellectually and morally. So the devil will take easy pickings, as he would see it. And the way that he would move through society was choosing women. John Knox famously said, women are the port and the gate of the devil. So they were seen as intellectually, morally weaker. That was the premise as to why it was women. And as Zoe touched on, when men were also, some men were witches, but even then that didn't really fit well with the idea of a man as following orders in the same way as a woman might. So some of them were upgraded to what was called warlocks. So they had that wee bit of status above witches. So it was like, even when you're talking about things that were completely made up, or the theology of how witches interacted with one another, sometimes men still got a higher status than women in the pecking order, even though these things were, quite frankly, a lot of the time, the stuff that was being said by people was delusional, because they've been unable to sleep for days and weeks. But the whole history of witchcraft had a particular significance to women. And if one even tries to think of how you would be alive at that time, during the 4 or 5 big periods of satanic panic, if it was called, you'd really be worrying not only for yourself, not only for your family members, not only for your friends, but if your friend was arrested, you'd be waiting for the knock on the door yourself. You know, it must have had a tremendous psychological impact upon people living at that time, to be living in genuine fear of being called a witch. And sometimes people record that, some groups record that and call that the witch wound. They say that's a wound that occurred to women accused of witchcraft from which we still haven't healed.
Yeah. And there are echoes, so many echoes of that process that you're describing on Twitter, for example. Lots of the what we talk about as Edu Twitter is absolutely riddled with that kind of misogynistic response. And we're seeing this constantly, I think, in social media just now. And the Everyday Feminism campaign has just been so powerful in terms of picking that up. But absolutely, this is not a dead issue. This is a live issue. Suzanne.
You know, I find myself struck by your comments that this history has got lost. And I'm thinking about the witch tours that are so popular amongst tourists. And so if you go to Edinburgh, in pre-COVID days anyway, it's very popular to go on a witches tour. I refuse to go on those, because when I hear the stories of witches told, and behind that I'm thinking about the pain and the terror. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you think those stories became so shallow? How did we retain this vision of a witch on a broom with a cat and a hat? How did we end up with that vision of witches, as opposed to some of the more historic discomfort that you're talking about?
I think the reason that it's kind of gotten lost over the years is because, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I think it's almost too big a thing for the mind to process. You can't hold in mind this idea that 2,500 at least people were killed for this, and were killed in the communities in which we still live. You know, like I live in Fife. There were lots, that was one of the hot spots for it happening. And once you start thinking about, you know, where these things happened, if you use the fantastic database that was created by the University of Edinburgh, if you start looking into where these things happened, you realize that actually it was like all over the place. And these were, once you make the connection that it was just a woman, usually a woman, it was just a normal person just going about their life who wasn't doing anything wrong. They might have been a bit, you know, difficult, or they might have owed money, or they might have had land that somebody else wanted, or they might have been a bit weird, you know, or they might have looked different, or, you know, it could be any sort of random and quite banal reason. And somebody could just say, well, she's a witch, he's a witch. And then that would be it. You'd be taken away and tortured until you confessed and you named other people who were also not witches, and you said they were witches, and then you would be garroted, and then your body would be burned. I mean, that's such a bonkers, crazy, you know, bunch of events to happen. I think that it's really hard in our lives to kind of go, well, that happened, and for like no real good reason. And I think it's almost too much for people to really kind of get their head around it. I think over time, maybe people kind of pushed it down and sort of said, we're not thinking about that, we're not talking about that. It was awful, and people would be also carrying shame. So if your mum, say, or your granny or your auntie or whatever was taken away and I was accused and was killed and you survived, you know, you wouldn't, I don't think you'd talk about it, because you would be fearful that it could happen and then you could get accused. So it would just be submerged, I think, over generations. And then it got mixed up with this idea where political cartoonists, apparently in I think the 1800s, Claire, maybe the 1700s, late 1700s, started to mock opponents of particular political parties by drawing cartoons where they were depicted as witches, meaning that they were old-fashioned, and they just drew them with the hat and the cat and the cauldron and all the rest of it to mock people, their opposition, basically. And then that had sort of also stolen imagery from the fact that women worked as alewives in the beginning. And when they were alewives, sorry, this is quite convoluted, but when they were alewives, it meant that they brewed the beer for their community. And that was a way that women, way back, made money for their family, to look after their family, because people couldn't drink water reliably, so they made ale. They had cats to keep the rats away. They had cauldrons to mix the stuff in. They wore the pointed hats so they could be seen in the marketplace, right? So all those little bits of it all got merged together and melded together, and then there became the stereotype of the witch. Now, put together with the fact that a lot of the witches were probably post-menopausal, so they're older women, and therefore become invisible and sort of negligible and no longer useful in society. I think it was really easy for people just to bundle that all together and just kind of go, ha ha ha, it was scary old ladies, and we can use it as a kind of a tale to frighten people, and it's just a kind of a spooky thing we can all have fun with. And I think that's basically where we've come to latterly.
Can we pick up the political point that you just made, the politics of witches, the politics of apologies, the politics of commemoration, because this is where what many people will see as a historic campaign, it slots right into very big contemporary issues, which makes what we're talking about today a big idea. So could we talk about the politics of commemoration? We have seen over the last year big movements around statues. The statue of Colston, a slave trader in Bristol, was at the heart of a Black Lives Matter rally in which a group of protesters brought down that statue and tipped it into the harbor. There were a lot of people who felt that they should not do that because that was changing history. That's just one example of the way in which statues and commemorations can become at the center and very symbolic for political movements. So can you talk about why you think a commemoration is important politically, not just historically?
I think it's important politically because I think what recent events have shown us is that people care about history being properly recorded. Now, when we talk about history, it's not just one thing. There's a phrase that said history is recorded by the victor in war. And in life, history is recorded by those who have the means and the power and the money to do so. So what happens is history is recorded at a level of society, of particular people who see society in their way, in that strata of people who've done things in battle, and a high level recording. For example, we can all go to a house and see how a queen lived hundreds of years ago. All those things are recorded and kept. However, what isn't recorded and kept has been historically the stories of the everyman, the micro histories of people who lived at that time. And with it, we lose a lot of detail in relation to what has made our society and how we are a society as we now are. So I think when people say you're changing history, you're not changing history. What you're doing is you're bringing a greater richness to history by making people aware of different histories, of micro histories, of histories of individual women. And that's why on the podcast, we always try at the start of every podcast to name 3 different women at least and tell what we know of their stories as individual people. So that in itself is a political act in saying we want representation of our history as women in Scotland, which acknowledges what has happened to them. And we want to be able to see that in public. I am not saying for an instant that we don't also want to see the lists and the records of people who have given their names in war, which is the names of men. But as our friend of the show, Sarah Sheridan, has pointed out, in the First World War, women were killed as well, but their names weren't recorded. It was literally a decision taken not to record those names. And maybe she would be able to tell us a wee bit more about that once again if we had her on the podcast. But so I think it's a basic function of your human rights as a right to freedom of expression as an individual to live in a society where you are reflected. That's part of that right. So I think politically The reason why I feel it's important that we have a memorial is so that we have an acknowledgement of the fact that these were women and men who suffered a terrible miscarriage of justice, so that we can remember the history of these people and what happened to them.
And this is feeding right into a huge debate around the whole teaching of history. So much, and particularly in England just now, there's so much of a focus on passing on a tradition and a culture which is very strong. I think for years we've tried to move towards a different approach to history in Scotland, a lot of emphasis around kind of work like E.P. Thompson's Making of the Working Class, you know, that type of thing, and that quest for the smaller narrative. And it's just interesting, isn't it? Even culturally, John McGrath's Cheviot Stag and the Black Oil was a real effort through art and creativity to get people to look again at history and, in your terms, Claire, I think, find themselves in it. So I really do think you're touching on a discussion which will be of huge interest, not just to history teachers in secondary schools, but to primary teachers, thinking about what is it we tell our children about their past? And it's their past, not the nation's past. And that's a really big and important idea, I think, that you're putting across there. Suzanne.
Well, I don't know if either of our guests want to come back to that, about this idea of how we construct history and really the power dynamics that are involved in that. Zoe, you're a teacher. Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an English teacher by training, and now I do support for learning. So I work across the school in different departments, wherever I'm kind of sent to. So that gives you a really interesting insight into what is being told across the school. And certainly I like the fact that when I've been in history classrooms, there's been, it's the same things often that were taught when I was at school. So the First World War is quite often talked about. And they focused a lot. When I was in, there was a really great teacher. He was talking about the groups of men that went away from particular communities. And I think Dundee has often, which is where basically I'm based, Dundee's been very good at looking at its own history and about the working class history. So I think my grandmother was a mill worker. And I've done work with Verdant Works in Dundee, which is about the history of the mills. And I think it really benefits people to think about the connection, about where their family came from. But I do think that with the move away from those kind of industries, that we've kind of lost actually our connection generally with our past. And I think a real effort needs to come back to that, about where people are in their place in society, because young people have got such a kind of homogenized approach to what it is to be human now. I mean, I've got 3 teens in the house. They're my children. They're not captives as well. But my I wish they'd leave. I leave the door open all the time. They've never gone. They're obviously just so focused now on being institutionalized. But my kids are 13, 16, and 18. So I'm in the very privileged position of experiencing their adolescence right up close. And it's interesting because they get a lot of their information. They've got everything at their fingertips. So they understand lots of things in quite a surface way. But it's quite American. It's very much through kind of an American lens. And I don't know how much they really know about their own connections to their own history. They're part Italian, so they know a little bit about that, but not really. And their Scottishness, they know a little bit about, but not really. And you can dip out of history, of course, in secondary school. So you can leave it behind. My youngest is going into second year, and I don't know if he'll be doing history much at that point. So it's interesting. So it would have to be something that you'd have to follow, and you'd have to be quite passionate about, maybe, to connect with. And I think that's a real shame. I think it's really important, but that's because I think history and English are very connected. I think they're essentially the same subject. A lot of people would really maybe argue against that, but it's the story of humanity, which I think is what English is.
Our question about the politics of apology in relation to witches is part of a broader international discussion about historic apologies. For example, the Bank of England and the Church of England have apologized for their role that their institutions played in the slave trade. And in the US recently, there's been renewed pressure from some quarters for apologies in regard to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. And very recently in Canada, A number of secret graves have been found of Indigenous children who died in residential schools run by the Catholic Church. And a request has been made by the Canadian government of the Pope to make an apology to the descendants of those families and communities from which the children were displaced, and you could even say stolen. But today, there's been no response from the church. So I'm just trying here to give a flavor that what you're asking for here in Scotland has resonance with much wider political energies. So why do you think an apology is needed for something that was so long ago as the witches?
Well, firstly, I think, I don't agree. It was a very long time ago. In the history of humans, it's a blink of an eye what happened. And secondly, well, there are a few reasons. I don't think it's a long time ago. I don't think it's ever too late for justice. We have posthumous pardons that have been given to other people. We have a history of doing that. The Scottish government relatively recently pardoned men who had been convicted of what would have been offences at the time, but are of course no longer offences in relation to homosexual acts. And at the time of passing the pardons, the Scottish government made it clear that what they wanted to make sure people knew was that it was wrong ever to have criminalised these people. And they made that both a collective and a posthumous pardon. So they made it not only for those people that were still alive, but also for those people that were dead. And it means something to properly record what has happened to people. We call ourselves the Witches of Scotland deliberately as it were a challenging act to remind people that that's how history records these women. What we want to do, if we are successful, is change to the women of Scotland. And that is why we call ourselves that. So I think that in trying to seek, insofar as we can, justice for these people, we're trying to properly record them in history, and doing so by way of commemoration and apology seems appropriate. The second thing that I think, and perhaps equally as important, is that people are still being accused of witchcraft today in some countries, and they are still suffering the terror and the horror of those accusations, which result in being outcast, which result in physical abuse, and also which results in death as well. And we're contacted by, and indeed the podcast has discussed with international humanist, Leo Igwe, award-winning humanist, whose job it is entirely to try and address accusations of witchcraft on the continent of Africa. So he spends his time doing that. So there is a literal modern day relevance to the fact that people are still living in communities where witchcraft allegations can happen. And in speaking to him, he said, it's incredibly important to me that a country such as Scotland sends out an international signal that what they did to people was so very wrong, because it allows me to take that and to go forward with that, to say, look, here is what's happened in another country. They have apologised for the type of things that they are doing, and to give him, I don't know, something, I suppose, to point at, to suggest that this is the way we should be dealing with people. We should not be accusing or othering people and blaming them for wrongs that have occurred to us. The subject matter is, of course, a lot more complex than that, but he was just saying that was one of the ways in which he could assist. So I think it has a modern day relevance. I never think it's too late for justice. And there is clearly something, when we all talk about things that have gone wrong in the past and the examples that Suzanne has just given us, one of the first things we do as humans is to say, who's going to apologise for this? This was wrong and it needs acknowledged and it needs an apology. And we just feel that instinctively as humans. And that's why people say these terrible things have happened, these terrible things have happened to children. Who is it that's going to apologise? So we as individuals feel that need, and I certainly feel the need, that these people deserve to be apologised to and given their correct place in history.
If I just come in there and add one other element, the apologizing helps to heal the trauma that came from that. Zoe, do you want to come in there just to comment on why is it that restorative justice, that apologies have this healing quality?
I think years ago when I was doing my teacher training in New Zealand, actually, we lived there for a bit and I trained there, and they were big into restorative justice in the community. And I just, when I realized how it worked, I just thought, yeah, God, that makes so much sense. If something's gone wrong and you recognize it, you acknowledge it, you apologize for it, then everybody can just then start to leave it behind and work on the effects of it instead of carrying the burden of not acknowledging it. And I think it's similar here with witches. I think culturally, we're not fantastic at saying sorry. And I think it's something that I really use in my practice in school is looking at, well, what happened? And it's not about dragging somebody over the coals. It's not about making them feel shame. It's about trying to make sure it doesn't happen again and understanding why it happened in the first place. So for me, that's super important personally, but with this issue with the witches, because, you know, as you've mentioned, David, there's an issue, for example, on social media about people attacking other people and othering other people, and, you know, and then people flocking to attack other people. That doesn't serve us. It doesn't help us as humans at all. So I think if we can recognize saying, right, why do things happen, acknowledge it, say sorry for it, and move on, then we can then deal with, as you're saying, Suzanne, the trauma of things that happen.
There's so much in that, I think, that you're opening up, and I'm fascinated by the public reaction to your campaign. How would you describe that?
It's been very positive for the most part. Occasionally when there is a piece done in a newspaper, such as like maybe the Scotsman or the Herald, in the comments section, you'll get a few people, and I have to say they're mostly men, certainly that's what their avatars suggest, is that they're men who say, oh, that's ridiculous. Are we going to go back and get an apology? One guy said recently, are we going to go back and look for an apology for Mary Magdalene? I was kind of like, didn't happen in the Scottish courts. There's not an awful lot we can do about that. Somebody else said to us, are you going to go to Italy and get them to apologize for the Roman invasion? And I was kind of like, God, honestly, I'm really missing the point here. You're just being boneheaded. Didn't say that. Try to be very, very polite and professional when we do talk to people. But sometimes people say things and you kind of think, who hurt you? Let's talk about what happened to you that you're being so aggressive on this issue, because it's going to cost us nothing to have this looked at and talked about and an apology to happen. It wouldn't cost anybody anything personally. And a lot of people, well, the few people that have complained about it have been quite hit up with that and have said, why are you wasting Scotland's money? It's not Scotland's money. We're doing this for free. It's Claire and my's time. And why are you wasting your time? You should be focusing on your jobs. And we're like, well, we're doing our jobs full time. This is on top, you know, and why are you so het up about it? It's strange. I think it says more about the commentator than about the issue, to be honest. But we have had a lot of support. I mean, we've had over 40,000 listens now to the podcast. We've had great engagement, and it's made a lot of people that didn't know about it to connect with it, and people that knew about it to have a deeper understanding and to tell more people about it now. So there's been a fantastic response, really, overall.
Yeah, it's not only a national response, we've had an international response. We have a huge number of listeners in the US, in Canada. We've got some Danish listeners, we've got German listeners. So there are people from all over the world listening to this history. And it's so strange that in Scotland, we know so little about it. Relatively speaking, the person that we interviewed, Rachel Christ, on the Salem witch trials, who is one of the curators of the Salem Witch Museum, said she's utterly fascinated when people come over from Scotland and want to know about our history. And she said, don't you know your own history? This is the idea that you would come over here to find out about witch trials was extraordinary to her. So we also relatively recently, I tweeted on a Sunday night, sitting in the house, just thinking, I thought, we'd recently interviewed the new Danish Witch Museum. And that's the Museum of Witch Hunts. We'd done the Salem Witch Trials Museum, and we'd also interviewed the Iceland Museum. That's of witches, in fact. and a tiny country the size of Iceland. And I thought we in Scotland, during the period of time that we're talking about this Witchcraft Act, accused and executed on average 5 times the amount of people as witches than anywhere else in Europe, and we do not have a museum. So I texted, would anyone be interested in a museum of witch hunts in Scotland? And the tweet went viral. We were getting contacted by people from abroad saying they want to come and visit it. We were getting contacted by public bodies in Scotland saying we'd be interested in it. Lots of individual people, lots of people involved in the tourist industry saying, this could be done sympathetically and in a way and in accordance with your interests at properly recording these histories. So yeah, we've had a quite overwhelming response to people knowing about it. And on an individual basis, we've had a number of people, again, mostly women, who have contacted us to say, thanks very much. I would just not have known that these people were in my community and these horrors were suffered. 1 or 2 women said, we've had quite visceral reactions to finding out that these happened in our local places, in our local church, which is still there, or in a local place. So from the sort of macro to the individual, there's been very positive response.
So Claire, just as we come toward the end, can I ask for one simple piece of information? If we get a pardon, apology, and an agreement to create a commemorative statue, who makes that decision? Who would issue that, just so listeners know how that process goes?
Okay, so what we're wanting is a pardon, an apology, and a memorial. Now, the way that we have tried to do that is we have publicly petitioned the Scottish Government, and the petition is now before the Petitions Committee. It will go out to various different interest bodies like the Justice Committee and Culture and Tourism, etc. And it will report back on it, and Parliament will decide whether or not we get those things. So Parliament would decide the petition and the apology and the national memorial.
We always finish off these programmes with the question, what do you expect teachers and people working in schools to do this? We've been so fascinated by what you've said, we're not even going to give you the chance to answer that question. I'm going to try and pick out these threads. I think huge issues about what we teach, about the importance of allowing children to find themselves in their own history, their own education, their own reading. Something really powerful about the importance of understanding who we are and where we came from and the extent to which we're shaped by our past and how we're represented in it. And I think also an awful lot about how we regard and how we treat people, and that massive emphasis on the importance of restorative justice, of approaches which engage everyone. And I think that, for me, would be the takeaway for teachers in terms of practice. And if I've got that right, can we just say a massive, massive thank you?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you would like to find out more about the Witches of Scotland campaign, you can do so on the website, witchesofscotland.com. You'll find there a survey and map of Scottish witchcraft. You can place an order for a t-shirt or hoodie or a coffee mug. You can listen to any of the podcasts that Zoe and Claire have recorded. There are nearly 40 of them now. And most importantly, you can find out how you or your students can become actively involved in the campaign. This is history in the making, which means it is also the future in the making. Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Ideas Hour.
This has been The Ideas Hour, brought to you by Suzanne Zeedyk and the real David Cameron.